This is Passport to Everywhere.
Who are we? That's the big question that Louise Leakey has spent her life studying. My guest today is a third-generation paleoanthropologist and National Geographic Explorer at large, who has spent much of her life searching for human origins in Kenya.
Now we live in a time where you've got such extraordinary tools to tell these stories with technology and AI and video. There's a real opportunity to engage enthusiasts around the world. So I guess our dream is really that we be part of a world that inspires a collective stewardship of our common future.
Welcome to Passport to Everywhere with Indigare's Melissa Biggs-Bradley. Melissa is the founder and CEO of Indigare, a travel and media company committed to inspiring and empowering people to change their lives and the world through travel, while having a positive impact on the places they visit. On the show, Melissa will reveal a behind-the-scenes look at some of the world's most treasured places, transport you to dream destinations and hotels, and introduce you to some of the most extraordinary people she's met on the road. This is Passport to Everywhere.
Traveling to other places often involves an element of experiencing our collective past. We visit museums, look at ancient artifacts, follow historians around a city, and walk in the footsteps and study the lives of those who lived before us. Exploring the Egyptian pyramids, the mosques of Istanbul, or just spending a day at the Louvre, every place in the world provides an opportunity for a new discovery about our origins and ourselves. Louise Leakey is no stranger to studying the past. In fact, she grew up doing it, and she goes back millions of years to humans' ancestors. Born in East Africa, Louise is the daughter of some of the most famous paleoanthropologists in the world. Her parents were Maeve and Richard Leakey, and her grandparents are Louis and Mary Leakey, which led to her being the youngest documented person to discover a hominid fossil at age 5. Her family has contributed enormously to understanding our African origins through their work in both Kenya and Tanzania. Louise earned her PhD in biology from the University College London and serves as a research professor in anthropology at the State University of New York at Stony Brook and a research associate at the National Museum of Kenya. She directs the paleoanthropological expeditions of the Koobi Fora Research Project, and her team's discoveries have changed our understanding of the diversity in the hominin fossil record. In 1999, her team actually discovered a new species at Lake Turkana that extended human fossil diversity back 3.5 million years, and according to the New York Times, overturns the prevailing view that a single line of descent stretched through the early stages of human ancestry. And we'll talk more about that. Louise also works with local communities and alongside wildlife authorities in plant and animal preservation. She gives both international and local talks and started an organization called Leakey Journeys and Expeditions to help safeguard our shared legacy through educational outreach, research, and travel. She strives to pass on knowledge to the next generation and distribute science stories to Kenyan school children. Her husband, Emmanuel de Merode, is the director of Virunga National Park in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, Africa's oldest national park and home to the endangered mountain gorillas. Louise's life is really one for the history books. She's traveled the continent extensively through adventure and exploration. She's a mother, a pilot, a winemaker, and an educator. And I'm so excited to have Louise with me to explore the transformative power of understanding our human origins. Louise, thank you so much for being with me today. With all of my podcast guests, I like to start at the beginning, and yours is a very interesting beginning. You're the third generation of some of the most famous paleoanthropologists in the world, and I know that as a child, you began helping sort bones at the age of 5, I believe, and then at the age of 12, you could drive a Land Rover and you would go off by yourself to pick up water for the team. What was it like growing up in this environment as a kid? Obviously, I should say, was in Kenya, I believe, or was it in Tanzania where you were growing up like this?
Yeah, so thank you for having me on the podcast. It's always fun to try and tell some of these stories. So I grew up as third in line, if you like, of a family of paleoanthropologists, paleontologists. And I remember my grandparents, Louis and Mary. Well, I don't remember Louis because Louis died the year I was born. But I do remember my grandmother, Mary, very fondly. And she always had a whiskey in the evening and a big cigar. You could smell her from a mile away down the corridors. And she always had them, whether she was on a sailboat or she was in her living room or perched on the edge of the Laetoli footprint site, which I do remember visiting her when the Getty Conservation Group actually re-exposed those footprints. And then, of course, my parents, Meave and Richard Leakey, were very involved in the National Museums of Kenya. So I grew up spending quite a lot of time in the museum, in fact, and I've got fond memories of the department that my mother was head of, the paleontology department. My father was director of the museum, so I used to spend lunches in Dad's office, and where he'd often have a nice steak sandwich or something we could come and scrounge off him. But the department days were full of lots of different scientists, always the fossils in the lab, lots of little jobs going on in those collections as well. Wonderful memories of life in the field, in the camps, which would be dragged out in the summer holidays. My younger sister, Samira, and I would live in the tents, and that's where I really learned to drive Land Rovers and to stick fossils and to what different bones actually look like. Is that a pig toe, or is this a bit of a turtle shell, or is that a monkey tooth, or does it belong to a baboon? Or so we really grew up knowing a lot about fossils. Although it was quite hot, there was always something going on, whether there were scientists or things to learn from the team, and the sounds and the smells of the kitchen they were cooking over the fire always in the evenings. And what was the most exciting of all those days in the field was the cool of the lake at the end of the day. We'd go for a swim, catch fish for dinner, or we would have a shower out of a bucket. But that cold water at the end of the hot day is probably one of my most fond memories from life in the field. But every day was novel and every day was exciting. Yeah, I had a very special and unusual childhood, but I guess I took much of that for granted.
That's human nature, I think, right? To adapt to your environment and not realize necessarily how it's different. But I wonder, did you always know growing up that you wanted to be doing the same thing as an adult and follow in the footsteps of your parents and your grandparents?
No, definitely not. I know I was always interested in science, and I always thought I would find myself in a profession that would give me sort of time outdoors and the excitement of discovery. We spent a lot of time at the coast as children during the December holidays. And so marine science was something that I thought I might get involved in down the line. So I really didn't know what field I would get into and hadn't really considered prehistory until I was actually asked to step up and take over the leadership of an expedition that my mother had just launched in 1993. I was 21 at the time, and my father had to go to hospital suddenly. So my mother had to accompany him, and I was doing my geology exams, I think, at Bristol University there at the time, and head back to Kenya. And she said it'd be really helpful if you would step up and run the expedition, because I'm going to be away for the next few months. And I'd rather not have to close the camp because we've got all these foreign scientists coming to work this site. And the site was called Lothagam, which is an 8 to 5 million year old site, and really had hoped to find lots of important fossils there. So she didn't want to cancel the field season. And so with the experience I'd had growing up, she felt that I would be well placed to work with the team and for the work to go on. So bear in mind, this was before the time that we had cell phones and good communications. So I jumped in the Land Rover. They head off to the UK for medical reasons, and I went north. And that's where I spent the next few months. And we found some good fossils, but it was quite hard to get any communications from how they were getting on in the field in the UK while I was in the field. So that was my introduction to leadership of the expedition. And then the following years, I then changed my studies more towards geology and paleontology, and continued to help co-lead the expeditions with my mother, which was tremendous fun. She was a wonderful mentor to me. And here we are. I'm still doing it. And I'm still wondering when I'm going to do my marine science degree and get involved in that. But maybe I'll be able to live that vicariously through my children, who seem to be as passionate about that as I was at that age.
That's amazing. Okay, so fast forward to today. What does a day in your life look like, or a year in your life? Are you still alternating between time spent with collections in the museums and also time in the field?
My days, I really vary. Every day is different. I'm either in Nairobi dealing with admin or trying to get to and from places to do lectures or to talk to school groups. And then I need to spend some time, obviously, on the ground in the field with the team, because they are day to day in the camp and actually working the site. So we do 7 months of field work a year, roughly. So January, February, March. And then we go June, July, August, September, typically. And so I'd rather spend every day in the field, to be honest. But unfortunately, that's had to change somewhat, because we've got to raise the money and we've got to actually talk about the work that we're doing. But when we're in the field, which is, as I said, teamwork. So I would head up from Nairobi. I fly a little aeroplane. So when I go north, I load the plane up with fresh supplies and people and things that are needed, and then land on a little runway near the field camp, depending on where they're working, and then join in with the camp life, where we're living in very basic tents, usually huddled under some thorn trees, not too far from where we can get water. And we'd set off early in the morning after a cup of tea, and we'll drive out to the site. And there's a bag of tools and usually an iPad. We'll always have a GPS with us as well. And the team would wander off looking for fossils. And when they find something, they would mark it and they take a photograph with an iPad or a cell phone. So we get a record of where things that they find are on the landscape. But then I would then go with a collection team, and we follow the points where the fossils have been found. We go back to where these fossils are so that we can then collect the fossils. And some of them need digging up, some of them actually need plastering, others just need collecting. And if it's an important fossil hominin, for instance, then that's when we begin to actually put in an excavation. And we could end up working on an excavation for several months. And sometimes we come back to it over the period of sort of several years as well. So it gets hotter throughout the morning, and we'll usually stop around about midday, find some trees to huddle under, have a rest from between 1 and 3 o'clock. Amazing how you can sleep lying on the sand at that time of day when you've had a little lunch. And then we set off back out to work again at between 3 and 5 o'clock. And some afternoons I'll actually spend in the lab trying to stick fossils together that we've picked up. But every day is different. And there's always a lot of fun to be had, whether it's the jackals coming in the evenings at night or the calling hyenas that wander around. Occasionally we've had jackals steal our shoes at night, which is always entertaining when you're trying to get to work early in the morning. But no, it's a lot of fun working with a team, and there's always a lot of laughter and discussion. And it's something very peaceful about being very far away from it all and living under canvas and actually doing the work. So despite it being quite difficult, it's actually quite a lot of fun as well.
How amazing. And Louise, the area that you're talking about now is the Turkana Basin in northern Kenya?
Yes.
And can you talk about why you chose that area? What makes it specifically rich for fossil digging?
So the thing about Lake Turkana, it's one of these very large lakes that have formed in the Rift Valley. And the Rift Valley, as you know, is the continent separating, where you've got the Somali plate that's moving east and you separating from the rest of the continent. And over time, that's left this depression into which water flows from the highlands either side over the past 4 million years or so, and has collected in these lakes, which are these lake basins. And the water flowing into these lake basins in the streams and seasonal rivers and big rivers, the rivers actually carry a lot of sediment. And the sediment then buries the remains of animals that living and dying on the floodplains and the shoreline environments. So as long as the bones of the animals that are dying there survive the elements and the vultures, jackals, and other natural sort of dispersion events, then they get buried. And in so doing, they mineralize, they start to become fossil. So by no means do the bones of every animal that was living in that region actually get preserved, but you get a little record through time, through these depositional events that give us a little window into the past, if we can actually then find them again. So the other thing about the Rift Valley, which is very different to sites in southern Africa, which are largely in cave sites, is that in the Rift Valley, you've got a lot of volcanic activity, and the volcanoes spew ash into the air, and those ashes contain these pumice stones, which have these crystals that are datable, these feldspar crystals, and you can get a radiometric date and a chemical signature of those ash horizons. And so that then gives us really good time frame in which we can then place the fossils that we find. So there's quite a lot of work done on understanding the geology of this region as well, which makes it incredibly helpful when we're studying and finding fossils from there. But then, of course, you've got these fossils that have been buried deep underground with time, and somehow they've got to get pushed back up to the surface again. And that happens because you've got a lot of tectonic activity in the Rift Valley. And so these deposits get tilted upwards, and these bones that are buried in those layers then get naturally exposed through erosion when it rains and there's wind. And it's those surfaces that we then walk over with the teams of fossil hunters, hoping to find a little bit of something that was preserved, say, 1.5, 2 million years ago. And then if we're lucky, it's something important. And it's only then that we'd begin to dig up a fossil and hopefully find more of it or enough of it to be important enough to excavate and study. So it's quite a process, and there's many different situations or circumstances that make this a very special site. It's huge. It's the lake itself is 160 miles in length and probably about 20, 30 miles wide in some places. And then the fossil deposits extend inland either side of this lake basin. You've got fossil sites there that go back 80 million years. You've got 30 million year fossil sites. You've got sites that are 15 to 20 million years. And then the age that I'm more interested in is between 8 and 1 million. And then you've even got deposits that go right through to the last 4,000 years. So there's a tremendous amount of time preserved in those deposits, which make this an extremely unique part of the world to study the past.
Amazing. And can you describe some of the most exciting discoveries that you've made in the last decade or two?
That's a tough one because there have been many. And we often hear most about the fossils of the human ancestors. And there have been many amazing finds like the Homo erectus skeleton, which everybody's heard about, the Turkana boy, which was found on the west side of Lake Turkana. I was 12 the year that was found, and the excitement of finding the bits of fossil in the excavation, and as a kid being asked to run across the river with a stick with a note in it to tell the team in camp what was being found at that moment, to come across and see what's going on. There are other fossils that we found more recently that every fossil that you find, nobody's ever seen it before. And it could be something new, or it could be more complete than things that we know from that same species. But some of the most exciting fossils, I think, sometimes are those that are not of the human ancestors. And so we found a complete elephant skull of an ancestral African elephant called Loxodonta, dated about 4 million years ago. And it's very unusual that you get complete elephant skulls. And you could actually work out that this must have been probably twice as heavy as some of the elephants that we have on the landscape today. But it was very complete. And you could actually estimate its body weight from that skull, but it had its teeth, the whole of the back of the skull, and even had its tusks that were slightly further away. We have
Wow.
enormous crocodile skulls, and all the way through you get little teeny tiny bird skulls and frogs. And most recently, we in fact published a paper where we have a trackway of footprints that were left by two different species of ancestors that seem to have walked across the same shoreline, muddy sort of environment, probably within the same day or within a couple of days, which was unusual because we've known that we've got several different species that exist in the same deposits at Lake Turkana, but they could have been separated by hundreds or thousands of years. We've never been able to prove that they did actually use the same environments, exactly the same environments, the same days, if you like. So when you see footprints and all the toe marks, you can actually picture these things walking across the landscape. And in fact, there were some giant bird prints as well, about 24 centimeters across. So they would have seen these very large storks and horses, if you can picture some sort of stripy zebra ancestors, maybe some antelopes as well. But it gives you a snapshot of what that place looked like in time. So that was quite fun as well. So there are many different exciting discoveries.
They all sound fascinating. As someone who has spent so much of your time looking back millions of years, and obviously your parents and your grandparents did too, but you're looking into prehistory in a way that very few people spend their days. Lots of people spend their time thinking about the future, their own future. How do you think that has influenced your thoughts or perspective on human beings? What have you learned about man in looking back at man and evolution?
So I think one of the things that's most striking is the fact that today modern humans are on this landscape or on planet Earth alone as a single species of an upright ancestor. And it's never been that way in the past. If you go back even 50,000 years, we shared the planet with Denisovans and Neanderthals and possibly some other ancestors in Africa and Indonesia as well. But we've somehow managed to survive various times of difficulty, let's say, where we know our population was reduced considerably, but somehow through our adaptability, which seems to be our strength, we have managed to carry on. And so, as well as that, to then move into every continent of the planet pretty much and populate it and manage to get ourselves into the numbers that you see that we're at today. So we've now at over 8 billion people on planet Earth, and the planet's never seen anything like this before. But I think it's the ability to adapt to different situations, to times of crisis, to survive, to move, to work out how to use technology to our advantage to then manipulate the environment to enable us to survive. I think that's one of the things that's so striking about Homo sapiens. And clearly, we did it better than any of our other upright walking ancestors. And that's why we're still here. The question is, are we smart enough to actually survive the next 100,000 years or thereabouts? And one has to question the way we live and if we're living sustainably enough. And are we actually living in harmony with nature? And the things that we don't often think about, the impact that it has. Just let's take the use of plastic, for instance. I was reading today about the fact that there's some 400 million tons of plastic produced each year. And 200 million tons of that end up in the oceans. And nobody thinks about that. We just carry on. So I don't know. This is certainly not sustainable. And I think that we're coming into a really tricky and testing time for this species. And I think that it's going to test our adaptability and see if we can actually then draw on technology and take that to a whole new level to see if our species will go forward. That's something that you and I are never going to know, but we've got to hope that is something that will happen in time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I interviewed an interesting woman last year where we were talking about the environmental issues. And she said, while she's not always hopeful about our species, she is hopeful about the resilience of our planet. And it was interesting. She said, I'm not sure that we'll make it, but I do think that nature in its wisdom will make it in a different form. It was fascinating.
Yeah.
And you work in the environment of the wilderness and you spend time there. And I think anyone who gets to do that ultimately is humbled by what nature itself represents and how it can recreate itself.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that you see how sudden change can drive extinction, and extinction in the fossil record the whole way back in time. So it does give you different perspective in terms of our place now, here and now, and the sudden and the dramatic changes that we see taking place will definitely have consequences. And so that's where it gets interesting.
You're listening to Passport to Everywhere, and I'm your host, Melissa Biggs Bradley. Today I'm speaking with National Geographic Explorer at Large, Louise Leakey, a third-generation paleoanthropologist searching for human origins in northern Kenya. If you're considering a trip to Kenya or anywhere else in Africa, head to indagare.com to read our destination guides, where we share our favorite places to stay, shop, and eat, all of which have been vetted by our team. Now, back to the show.
One of the things that's so interesting is the work that you've done in training the next generation of fossil hunters. And I'm curious if you would talk a little bit about your research project in the north of Kenya at Koobi Fora.
So actually the work at Koobi Fora on the east side of the lake, it began in 1968. And that's the year that my mother and father, they went north up the eastern side of the lake, and they established a little camp the following year at the site. It's a little sandy spit that juts out into halfway up the lake, if you like. And that site is called Koobi Fora, and that's the name that we gave the research project because it was based out of that little research camp. So the research project is called the Koobi Fora Research Project. And we always used to launch the expedition from Nairobi, and it would go up in all of these trucks and Land Rovers, and you'd take fuel and supplies from Nairobi to survive the next 3 months. And you'd then move your camp around. But that would be the sort of base at that camp on the sandy spit. And then the exploration over the next 10, 15 years was focused on the east side of Lake Turkana, and then moved to the west side of Lake Turkana and throughout the 80s. And so it was 1983, 1984 that they started working the sites on the west side, which is when they found the Turkana boy. And then towards the end of the 90s, they found the Kenyanthropus and other fossils from further south. So there was exploration then on the west side, which also began to contribute new finds to the fossil record. And then we came back to work on the east side again when I got involved just after my PhD, so around about 2002 or thereabouts. And then we started to go back to sites that had been worked previously. And if you go back to sites that have been worked and you give 20, 30 years of time, new things have eroded and come out onto the surface again. So we were working sites that had been previously worked, but you're finding a whole lot more fossils that have come out of the ground. And so whereas in the early days, the team used to come up from Nairobi in all of the trucks, in more recent years, I've been able to engage the often school leavers from the north. So people from Ileret, the Dasanich tribe from Ileret, and the Gabra who come across from Marsabit and North Hor, as well as the Turkana people from and the teams are now built from the local communities, and they're the young a younger generation, men and women. And many of them are actually children of the generation that worked with my parents in the North. So it's actually multi-generational, which is quite fun. And one of my greatest friends and colleagues that helps me co-lead the expeditions now to Turkana is in fact the youngest daughter of Kamoya Kimeu. And Kamoya was the man who was my father's coordinator of all the field work and found many of the important fossils. So he actually found the Turkana boy. And so I feel like I know Jennifer particularly well because I knew her father so well, and she is so like him in many ways. And we met a couple of years ago, and we've been working together ever since. So it really is a generational, if you like, occupation where we're building on teams of people that have been part of the work through several generations. And we spend a lot of time talking to school kids, and hopefully we can inspire some of the next generation to get involved. They're often youngsters who stand on the edge of an excavation asking us what we're doing and want to get involved. And they obviously still speaking only the Turkana or the language, but they're always very curious and in fact very helpful. Often they know not to pick fossils up. They leave them where they are and they'll tell us, oh, we found something over there, come and have a look. But it's always important, therefore, to work with people from the local communities if you really want to preserve this work and these fossils for future generations. They've got to be involved at every level.
Amazing. And I know a lot of the fossil finds that your family's collected and many others are in the Nairobi National Museum, and they've also been studied in the labs that your father created there. Can you talk a little bit about the museum? Because honestly, I think a lot of people travel to Nairobi and don't know that it's there or that they should be visiting. And I'd be curious to hear your perspective on why it's so important and what some of the challenges are.
Yeah, absolutely. So the National Museums actually, believe it or not, was established in 1930. And that at that time, that was a man called Sir Robert Correndon. And so it was at that time named the Correndon Museum. And it was then renamed the National Museums of Kenya after independence, which was after 1963. And so collections that had been made throughout those years, important records of everything from beetles to butterflies to osteology collections, plants and ethnography objects as well. They were all stored in the museum, but obviously they didn't have much space. And so when my father came in and got involved as director of the National Museums in 1968, and he directed it until 1989, in fact. So a good 20 years. And actually, I think he was about 23 when he first became director of the National Museums. He realized that the museum needed more space. And so he set about trying to raise money to put in some new buildings. And in fact, the buildings today that house the collections, the archaeology and paleontology collections and the hominin collections were completed in 1977. So there's a public side of the museum, obviously, which includes the galleries. But behind the scenes, there's obviously this massive and hugely important scientific collection, which has been built over the years. And so it's that which we've got to make sure that we safeguard for future generations and for the world, because if it's not looked after, many of these things you're never going to be able to replace again, because either they don't exist in the wild or they're very rare in the wild. And they're still important because you can use collections and apply new techniques and study them if you've actually got them. So collections are important, not just to the country, but to humanity. And so the country has an obligation to really look after them. And it's very difficult in a country like Kenya today, where you've got so many other priorities that need funding and support. It's quite hard to try and channel funds towards collections and museums. And often, I think, similar to many museums in other parts of the world, particularly in the States, you've actually got to raise private funding to support maintenance of these collections for the future. So this is one of the things we've got to do today, is try and look forward and see how we could try to preserve and raise the support and build the infrastructure that's going to ensure that the collections are safe and there for the future, because they are some threats today and challenges that the museum are facing.
I totally agree with you that it's a challenging time around the world, and particularly in Africa, to raise funds for any kind of institution. But when you're making the argument that we do need to protect these things for all species going forward, to understand where they came from, what is the sort of way that you explain why this is so important and why this shared history is so essential for us to understand who we are today?
Yeah, I think the thing is that the collections that we don't see often, the behind the scenes, if you like, are actually filled with irreplaceable, unique objects. And somehow you've got to keep these things safe, whereas we may not know their significance and importance necessarily today. So there's a rare beetle. If we let that go, if we let it degrade to the point that it doesn't exist anymore, we've lost something that was so important to the world. The fossils are obviously iconic because people know about them or have heard about them, but they know about the most important skulls, but there's a lot more to the collection of fossils. Say the hominin collection, you've got isolated teeth and finger bones and limb bones, and all of those build up the knowledge that we have about any one species. And we certainly don't know much about it, or as much as we will know when you get new techniques and new ways of studying things in the future. So I think you've got to safeguard these, because I think there's a lot more to be learned from them. So it's not that we've found them, we've studied them, and that's done, and it doesn't matter if they fall apart. These things are going to be incredibly difficult to ever replace. You may never find another Homo erectus complete skeleton, and you may never find another skull of Kenyanthropus, say. And so the fact that these things exist as unique objects, we've really got to make sure that they're maintained to a very high standard with all the information that goes with them, which includes location and old photographs and old notes. And so that in time, when suddenly you can extract a bit of DNA from something we always thought you never could extract DNA from because they've advanced their way of doing things, as an example, let's say, then that you still actually have the fossils intact and securely stored for not just the next 2 generations, but the next generation that may come in 100 years from now or so. So I think there's a real argument that we've got to keep these things safe, despite the challenges that exist today of governments that have so many other priorities. At some point, it all might be working and it will be properly funded. But in the meantime, we've got to try and shore up and make sure that these things are kept for the future.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, you mentioned the example of DNA technology as something that has changed. Obviously, there's lots of technology that we still don't even know that will give you new information. But I'm curious, how have you used technology in the last 10 years that's come online to reveal different things about the fossils than you previously understood?
Technology has obviously come on leaps and bounds. For the study of the fossils, specifically, I would argue that the imaging ability to actually look internally at some of the fossils in using micro CT or using the beamline, the synchrotron, where you get these X-ray beams that give you really detailed, high resolution imagery of the internal structure of teeth and different sutures, structure of bone as well. And so that's enabled us to say things and actually enlarge the sample size in many cases of, say, teeth that you can't see from the outside, but are preserved internally. And so that's been a major step forward, because you can look at structures that you wouldn't be able to do from just the surface of a physical fossil. The other thing where we've made big steps forward is actually in terms of the ability to record where things are found. So if you go back to the days that my parents were first working on the east side of Lake Turkana, when they'd find a fossil, yeah, you could write a number in a notebook. But if you pick it up and you walk off with it, you lose all context of where the thing was found. And so where they tried very hard to record exactly where things were found, they actually put a cement post in the ground. But over time, the cement post has eroded away, or a youngster herding his goats have picked up the cement post, and it no longer is in exactly the same place that they'd put the post in 1972 or something. But they flew lines of photographs, aerial photographs from an aeroplane. Each had a unique number, and each represents probably about 10 kilometers or 10 square miles. And you could then try and work out which river or which hill you were standing on when you picked a fossil up, and you then mark it by pushing a pin through and writing a number on the back side of the photograph. And so we got hundreds of photographs with numbers where fossils of all sorts of different animals, but including the hominids, were actually found. But the thing they did, which was really important, was that when they picked up a hominin, they actually took a photograph of the hillside with a man holding a stick exactly where the fossil was collected from. So you can today go back and recreate that exact position. And today, of course, you've got a GPS, not only on your phone or in your pocket. You can actually retake the photograph with the GPS fix, and you can then bring that into big systems that enable us to combine the points that we're finding today with points that were found in the 1970s. And in some cases, things that we found in the more recent past actually belong to specimens that were found in the 70s as well. So I think that whole side of things, the mapping, the ability to mark and work out where things were found in the past and where things are being found today, that's made a major difference to the way we work, and actually how we place things on the landscape and to work out the dates. The dating's also, the technology in terms of the field of dating sites has improved dramatically, and the resolution of dates has improved as well. But there's lots of different approaches now. I think in some cases where you can get organic content from bone, Neanderthals and Denisovans from Asia and outside of Africa have thrown up some huge surprises in the recent past, where we can look at the genome and see that there was some mixing with modern humans at some point in the recent past, in the last 60,000 or years or thereabouts, which we'd never have been able to imagine in the 70s. So we are actually living in a really exciting time. And who knows what we're going to be able to do now with drones and mapping and with machine learning and AI. And I think we may be able to serve images up to people sitting in America, and they'll be able to help us finding the fossils at Lake Turkana if we can tie the two things together and actually spot things that we might have missed while we're on the ground.
That's fascinating to think of. I'm curious, because you're talking about having people help in an excavation. I know you started something, or you're involved with Leakey Journeys, which supports science storytelling and trips that allow people to participate in field work and excavations. Can you tell me a little bit about how this came about and what your dream for it is?
Yeah, so with Leakey Journeys and Expeditions, I felt that what we really need to do going forward. So if I can go back and just say that it was my grandparents that really put Africa on the map as where we all come from. And then my parents and their team really found lots of fossils that added to that story. And then I stopped to think, what is it that we can do? What's our generation? What do we need to do? And so what we really need to do is we need to continue to explore the past, But we really need to inspire the future as well, because what's the point of finding these things if we can't make that exciting and engaging? And so we decided that we needed to create Leakey journeys, which in some ways a journey is a story, it's a lecture, it's traveling to the part of the world where you can actually experience the fossils. But it means that we can actually share the discovery of these new fossils with people around the world and hopefully get people excited about the amazing story of where we all came from. So this is where the idea was seeded. But we definitely need to get more students excited about this work. We need to try to train more scientists to carry on the work going forward. Teachers need to be able to understand it and tell the stories to students as well. And I think now we live in a time where you've got such extraordinary tools to tell these stories with technology and AI and video, social media, although I'm absolutely appalling at social media. But there's a real opportunity to bring this science to life. And so where we still actually definitely have to have boots on the ground finding new fossils, because that's obviously what's really exciting and important, there's a real opportunity to engage enthusiasts around the world and to make them feel part of this journey. So I guess our dream is really that we be part of a world that really values humanity's shared African origins and inspires a collective stewardship of our common future. I think that would be the way you could put that in a nutshell, if you like, what we dream for.
That's beautifully said. And I think that's a dream that I certainly will share with you. And I do believe that more people who experience time in Africa, the more there is a shared sense of stewardship. So I love that. Thank you so much. This has been a total treat, Louise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Louise, for joining me today to explore human origins. For more on Louise, follow at Louise Leakey, that's LouiseLeakey, on Instagram. Coming up, I'll be covering one of the best wellness clinics in the world. Tune in next week to find out where it is, and for more travel tips, follow us on Instagram at Indagare Travel. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us at Passport to Everywhere. We hope you'll join the journey and subscribe. For more travel inspiration, visit indagare.com, INDAGARE. This has been Passport to Everywhere.